I slept alone for years, until my wife's sister whispered at my door one night. He had been married for over 10 years, but the closeness that people expect from a married couple had slowly faded from his life. At first, it was little things. His wife spending late nights at work, or him staying up reading while she watched television in the living room. Small, unnoticed distances that seemed normal at the time. He told himself that these were just phases, temporary separations that would soon pass. But as weeks turned into months, and months into years, those small distances grew wider. What had started as small gaps in their daily routine became a wall separating them emotionally and physically. He learned to live in that space quietly. Their home, once full of laughter and chatter, had grown quiet in a way that felt heavy. In the mornings, he would wake up before his wife, make a cup of tea, and sit in the kitchen watching the sunlight spill across the floor. She would stay in bed, scrolling on her phone, barely acknowledging him. He tried talking to her about it at first, asking casually why they never ate breakfast together or why they didn't spend time in the evenings like they used to. She would smile politely and say she was tired, or that it wasn't a big deal, and he would nod, forcing a smile of his own. But inside, he felt a dull ache he didn't know how to name. Bear. Despotiste. Sleep was the hardest part. For years, he slept alone in the spare bedroom, a mattress pushed into a corner, sheets tucked tightly, pillows stacked just so. At first, it was temporary, a solution when their schedules didn't match. But eventually, it became the norm. Nights stretched long, silent and lonely. He remembered how different it had been when they first got married. Back then, the warmth of her beside him had felt comforting, her breathing a gentle rhythm that made the world outside feel distant. He missed that more than he could admit, even to himself. Now, the empty room around him felt like a constant reminder that something he valued deeply had been quietly slipping away. He began to notice the little things that added up to this quiet life. Shared jokes had disappeared, replaced by polite nods or brief, functional conversations. The sound of her voice, once comforting, now carried a hint of impatience or distraction. When they went out, she seemed distant, absorbed in her own thoughts or phone, while he tried to fill the silence with casual conversation that often died mid-sentence. Even their friends noticed it sometimes, asking innocently, "Are you two okay?" And he would shrug, forcing a laugh, saying, "Yeah, everything's fine," though inside he was not always loud. Most of the time it whispered at him in quiet moments, the clink of a spoon against a cup. In the morning, the empty side of the bed at night, the soft rustle of sheets that were untouched. He tried to convince himself that it was enough to be near her in the same house, even if they weren't truly connected. But the human heart doesn't always accept convenience as love. It wanted more. It wanted attention, warmth, and the simple reassurance of being seen and valued. In those years, he also began to notice how people around him seemed to experience marriage differently. Friends would post pictures online of cozy evenings, holding hands at dinners, or couples laughing together in parks. At first, he tried not to compare, telling himself that social media only showed the best moments, the curated happiness. But comparison, even when we resist it, leaves small cracks in our contentment. He started to feel that maybe everyone else had figured out something he hadn't, that maybe intimacy was something he had somehow lost the ability to maintain. Work became a refuge and a distraction. He threw himself into long hours, deadlines and projects, anything to avoid the quiet of home. Colleagues knew him as diligent, perhaps overly committed, and he didn't mind the reputation. At least at work he felt needed, valued, even if at home he felt invisible. But late at night when he returned to the empty side of the bed, that brief sense of importance vanished, replaced by the echoing emptiness of their apartment. He tried to understand her perspective. Maybe she was tired. Maybe life had simply worn her down. Maybe the spark they had shared in the early years had faded naturally, and he was clinging to memories that no longer mattered to her. He didn't blame her openly. He kept the disappointment inside, carefully hidden. Expressing it, he feared, might make her defensive or create an argument he wasn't ready to have. So he bottled up the frustration, the sadness, and the quiet longing that filled the empty room every night. He became an expert at appearing calm and content, even while his heart quietly mourned what was missing. Family gatherings were no better. Sitting side by side at holiday dinners, he felt a hollow space between them. Conversations that should have included gentle teasing or shared memories were often one-sided. He asked himself how he could have allowed their lives to drift apart so much without noticing the slow erosion of connection. And yet, the idea of addressing it head-on terrified him. He worried about what she might say, how she might react. It seemed safer to let things stay as they were, even if it left him aching in silence. Friends occasionally tried to offer advice, suggesting that he find ways to reconnect, take trips together, or attend counseling. He considered it, sometimes even seriously, but he was afraid. Fear of rejection, fear of confrontation, and the fear of discovering that perhaps she no longer wanted what he wanted kept him from taking the first step. So the years continued in the same rhythm: work, quiet evenings alone, lonely nights, and a growing sense that life was passing him by while he remained trapped in a marriage that no longer felt like a partnership.
He developed coping mechanisms.
Reading late into the night, listening to music, or writing in a journal helped. But they were small comforts, never substitutes for real connection. He even began talking to a few close friends about the loneliness, careful to phrase it without blame, to avoid embarrassment or judgment. Their advice was practical but never completely satisfying. No one could really understand the unique ache of sleeping in a house with someone who used to be your closest companion, and yet now felt more like a stranger. Even as he adapted, there were moments when the sadness broke through. The sound of her laughter on a phone call to a friend, the way she left dishes in the sink instead of doing them, the way she barely noticed a new haircut or a small change in his wardrobe. All of it chipped away at the sense of intimacy they once shared. He would sometimes lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was the life he had chosen, or if it had simply been what life had chosen for him. These thoughts were heavy, unrelenting, and difficult to share. But yet, despite everything, he didn't give up hope. Somewhere deep inside, he still believed that things could change, that maybe, if they tried, they could rebuild the closeness they had lost. Pretentious. That hope was fragile, but it was persistent, like a tiny flame flickering in the dark. It kept him going through the long nights of solitude, through the quiet dinners and half-hearted conversations. And so, he continued, carrying the weight of his loneliness quietly, waiting, perhaps unknowingly, for a moment that could change everything. Life at home continued in its quiet rhythm, the kind of rhythm that had grown familiar over the years. He woke, worked, returned, ate dinner in silence, and slept alone. But one afternoon a phone call disrupted that routine. It was his wife's younger sister, whom he hadn't seen much since she moved to another city. She sounded hesitant, almost unsure, but explained that she had been going through a rough time and needed a place to stay for a few weeks. She asked if it would be okay to come. His wife agreed quickly, almost cheerfully, saying it might be nice to have her around. He felt a small twinge of unease, though he didn't know why. Still, he agreed. When she arrived, she'd brought with her a freshness that seemed to fill the silent house. She moved in quietly, careful not to disrupt routines, but her presence was impossible to ignore. She smiled warmly at him, asked about his day, and seemed genuinely interested in his life. That alone was startling. For years he had lived with silence, so even the smallest attention felt almost overwhelming. She unpacked her things, hummed lightly while arranging her room, and occasionally laughed at a television show he hadn't watched in years. It was strange and yet comforting to have life returning in small, ordinary ways. The first few days were cautious. He tried not to think too much about her presence beyond the simple fact that she was a guest. They ate meals together occasionally, though he still felt awkward. He noticed, however, how she watched him carefully during conversations, as if she could sense the loneliness he carried silently. She never commented on it directly, but he sometimes caught her eyes lingering a moment too long, her expression soft, almost understanding. It was unnerving in a way, because it forced him to acknowledge feelings he had spent years ignoring. One night, after dinner, she knocked lightly on his door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the knock startled him. He hesitated before opening the door, unsure what she might want. She spoke in a soft, almost whispering tone. "I can't sleep. Can I talk to you for a few minutes?" He hesitated, but something in her voice, honest and unassuming, made him nod. She stepped inside, and they sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet room. The air was heavy at first, full of unspoken tension, yet there was also an unexpected warmth in simply having someone notice his presence, someone care enough to come to him in the middle of the night. They began talking quietly, cautiously at first. She asked him about his work, about small things in his life that he had shared with almost no one. He felt the walls he had built around himself slowly begin to lower. It was strange to talk to someone outside the immediate pressure of family expectations, someone who didn't judge him for years of quiet loneliness. She listened. That alone was enough to make him feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in years. Night after night, their conversations continued. They spoke of trivial things at first: work, hobbies, shared memories of the past, but gradually the talks became deeper. He found himself sharing fears and regrets he had long suppressed. Breath. She responded with empathy, never judgment, never trying to force answers or offer solutions he wasn't ready for. It was a kind of intimacy he had forgotten existed. The quiet understanding between two people, the acknowledgement that life was sometimes heavy, and it was okay to admit it. He noticed changes in himself. The weight of loneliness, which had pressed down on him for years, began to feel lighter, if only a little. She didn't fix anything, but she didn't have to. Her simple presence, her willingness to listen without interruption or judgment, made the long, quiet nights bearable. He began to look forward to her knocking at the door, a small beacon of connection in an otherwise silent house. Yet, even as he felt comforted, guilt crept in quietly. He loved his wife, or at least he remembered loving her. He knew that if she knew about these late-night conversations, she might misinterpret them or feel hurt. He told himself again and again that nothing inappropriate had happened, that it was only talking, only understanding. Still, he couldn't shake the unease that came with this unexpected emotional closeness. He had spent years alone in a marriage that was emotionally distant, and now someone else had entered the space he had reserved for private pain. Meanwhile, the sister confided her own struggles. She had faced difficulties in her work and personal life, feeling isolated and unsure of her future. Her presence in the house wasn't only about seeking support. She also sought guidance, someone to hear her worries, someone who could offer perspective. And he found himself providing that quietly, naturally, without thinking. They shared small moments of laughter, recalling memories from family gatherings, or joking about everyday mishaps. In these moments, life felt lighter and more bearable than it had in years. At times, he reflected on the irony of the situation. Here he was, in a house where he had long felt invisible, finding understanding in a person who was technically an outsider to his marriage. It wasn't easy to admit, even to himself, that this emotional connection was fulfilling something that had been missing at home, but it was also undeniable. The loneliness that had once seemed permanent began to ebb, replaced by a quiet warmth, a sense that someone truly saw him again. Breaths. The nights they spent talking also forced him to confront uncomfortable truths. He realized that he had let years pass without truly communicating with his wife, that he had silently tolerated distance instead of addressing it directly. And while the sister's presence helped him feel alive again in a way, it also reminded him of the neglect that had led to this situation. The awareness was painful, yet necessary. For the first time in years, he was forced to acknowledge that some part of the marriage's distance was not just natural life changes, but something that could have been addressed had he acted sooner. He also noticed subtle changes in his daily life. The chores, the meals, the simple routines that had once felt monotonous now seemed lighter because of her energy in the house. Small gestures, a smile, a shared joke, or a cup of tea made for him, carried weight he had long forgotten.
Even the silent evenings were now punctuated with conversation, the simple rhythm of talking, listening, and being heard.
Thus, he realized that connection, even when it comes from an unexpected source, can make the familiar surroundings of life feel new again.
And yet, he remained cautious.
He reminded himself repeatedly that boundaries were important, that this was not about replacing his wife or betraying trust.
He wanted to feel close to someone without overstepping lines or causing harm.
It was a delicate balance, but he tried hard to maintain it. He realized that part of growing emotionally was recognizing these feelings without acting on impulses that could create damage. He wanted to preserve the integrity of his relationships, even as he allowed himself to feel a kind of emotional relief he hadn't experienced in years. The presence of the sister also offered moments of reflection about his own needs. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that emotional neglect is just as significant as physical distance in a marriage. He had spent years sleeping alone, feeling unseen, and pretending that routine and obligation were enough. Now he recognized the depth of his own need for connection, attention, and empathy. He began to consider that intimacy wasn't only physical. It was emotional, daily, and quietly demanding. That awareness unsettled him, but it also gave him clarity about what he had been missing and what he might seek in the future. Their nightly conversations continued for weeks, sometimes lingering into the early hours. Topics ranged from small worries to life-changing reflections, from shared memories to aspirations that seemed impossible. They never forced conversation. It flowed naturally, comfortably. But in this space, he rediscovered a part of himself he had thought lost, the ability to trust, to share, and to feel understood. And for a man who had spent years in silence, this was an awakening in the quietest sense. He didn't know where it was leading, only that he felt something he hadn't in years, alive, seen, and appreciated. It was an unusual situation, complicated by the fact that it involved family, but it also reminded him that emotional connection is a fundamental human need. As long as he stayed mindful of boundaries, he told himself, it was possible to experience comfort and understanding without harming anyone. By the end of the second week, the house no longer felt empty in the same way. The quiet that once pressed down on him now carried the possibility of conversation, of empathy, of human attention. He had learned that loneliness could be eased, not by ignoring it, but by allowing someone to notice it without judgment. The sister's presence didn't erase the distance between him and his wife, but it offered a temporary reprieve, a reminder that even small gestures of kindness and understanding could light the darkness that had long enveloped his nights. And so, life continued, subtly changed. The house was still the same, the routines familiar, but something inside him had shifted. The knock at the door, the whispered conversation, had done more than provide company. It had reminded him of what it felt like to be noticed, valued, and heard. For the first time in years, he slept with a lighter heart, a quiet sense that life, even in its most lonely moments, could bring unexpected solace. As the days turned into weeks, the quiet connection he shared with his wife's sister began to grow stronger. At first, it had been simple conversations in the middle of the night, brief talks about work, life, or shared memories. But now, the talks had deepened into something more meaningful. They discussed dreams, regrets, and frustrations, things he had never said aloud in years. For the first time in a long while, he felt that someone truly understood him, and it was both comforting and unsettling at the same time. He began to notice subtle changes in his daily life. The heaviness he had carried for years started to lift, replaced by a quiet warmth whenever she was around. Perhaps her laughter in the kitchen, the way she hummed softly while making tea, or even her casual questions about his day.
It all seemed to matter more than he expected.
Breaths. He found himself looking forward to her visits and her questions, and he caught himself lingering in conversation with her longer than necessary.
It wasn't something he had planned. It just happened naturally, as human beings sometimes find comfort in unexpected places.
Yet, as the bond grew, he couldn't help noticing a tension forming inside him. He loved his wife, or at least the idea of her, the life they had built together. He didn't want to betray that trust or cause hurt, but he also couldn't ignore the connection he was developing with someone else, someone who seemed to understand the loneliness he had carried for so long. He struggled to balance the comfort he felt with the guilt that lingered in the back of his mind. Each conversation left him both lighter and heavier. Lighter because someone finally noticed his pain, heavier because he knew it wasn't entirely right. At the same time, he noticed changes in her behavior as well. She seemed more open, more relaxed around him than with anyone else in the house. Her presence was no longer just a temporary stay. It was becoming a part of his life. She confided in him about her own struggles, career setbacks, moments of self-doubt, and personal challenges she had faced in silence. He listened carefully, offering advice when he could, but mostly just offering a patient, understanding ear. And in doing so, he realized that their conversations were no longer just about passing the time. They were about emotional survival, a mutual need for connection that neither of them had anticipated. The emotional closeness was comforting, but also confusing. He started to notice himself thinking about her during the day, replaying snippets of their conversations in his mind. Sometimes he would recall a laugh or a smile and feel a strange warmth that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, at least not yet. It was more about being seen, being understood, and having someone care in a way he had longed for but hadn't realized he needed so deeply. But this closeness also brought challenges. Began noticing the line between emotional support and dependency, and he worried that the growing bond could create problems for everyone involved.
He was careful not to cross boundaries, but the line was thin and blurry at times.
The sister's kindness, her attentiveness, and her understanding stirred feelings he had not felt in a long time, and that awareness sometimes scared him. He knew that prolonged emotional intimacy, especially in a situation like this, could lead to complications he didn't want. One evening, they stayed up longer than usual, talking in whispers about regrets from the past. He shared memories of the early years of his marriage, how close they had once been, the small joys and shared experiences that had faded with time. She listened patiently, offering gentle observations, and he realized how much he had missed being truly heard. It was more than companionship. It was validation, a recognition that his experiences and emotions mattered. He felt a flicker of hope that perhaps things could be better, even if he didn't yet know how. Yet, the more they shared, the more he became aware of the fragility of the situation. He had spent years trying to ignore the emotional distance in his marriage, convincing himself it was normal. Now, with someone else noticing his pain, the truth became impossible to avoid. He saw clearly how lonely he had become, and how much of his emotional life had been neglected. This realization was painful, but it also gave him clarity. He understood that while the sister's presence offered temporary relief, The real issues lay within his marriage, in the absence of communication, attention, and shared understanding over the years. He also noticed the subtle effects of their growing bond on the household. His wife was busy with work, unaware of the depth of the nightly conversations, but he knew that if she discovered them she might feel hurt or confused. The awareness of this possibility weighed heavily on him. He wanted to maintain the trust and respect he owed to his wife while also allowing himself to experience the rare comfort of feeling understood. Balancing these conflicting emotions was exhausting, but he had little choice. He had already invested emotionally in these conversations, and cutting them off suddenly felt impossible. As days turned into weeks, he found himself reflecting on human connection in ways he hadn't before. He realized that intimacy isn't always physical. It can be emotional, quiet, and subtle. He remembered the warmth of his wife's attention in the early years, the conversations they used to have, and the laughter they shared. And he understood that what he now felt with his sister was a reminder of what had been missing, not a replacement. That distinction was important. It allowed him to experience comfort without crossing lines he knew he shouldn't. There were moments when he almost questioned his own judgment. He wondered if relying on the sister for emotional support was fair to her, whether she was placing herself in a difficult position by being so attentive. Reflected on her struggles too, and realized that she, like him, needed connection, understanding, and someone to listen. In this sense, their conversations were mutually beneficial, helping both of them cope with emotional challenges in a safe, contained way. Still, the complexity of the situation never fully disappeared. He also noticed a new awareness of himself emerging. For years, he had tried to survive emotionally within a distant marriage, adapting to isolation without fully understanding its impact. Now, with someone noticing him, listening to him, and offering gentle support, he began to see the ways he had suppressed his own feelings. He had been polite, patient, and accommodating, but that came at the cost of his own emotional health. The sister's presence had unwittingly forced him to confront those suppressed feelings, and he realized he needed to address them if he was ever going to find fulfillment in his life. Some nights the conversations stretched late into the early morning, filled with quiet laughter, shared reflections, and gentle reassurances.
In these moments, he felt alive in a way he hadn't in years.
The loneliness that had once pressed down on him so heavily seemed to lift, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. It was a reminder that human beings are social creatures, wired to need understanding and empathy. Even small gestures, like listening, acknowledging, or caring, could restore a sense of connection that had long been missing. Despite the comfort, he remained vigilant about boundaries. He reminded himself that nothing inappropriate had happened, that their relationship was still grounded in mutual respect and understanding. He focused on emotional support and shared experiences, avoiding actions or words that could lead to misunderstanding.
This vigilance was tiring, but it allowed him to maintain a moral compass in a situation that could have easily become complicated.
By the end of the third week, he noticed subtle shifts in his own behavior. He was more reflective, more aware of his emotional needs, and more conscious of the ways he had neglected himself for years. He realized that emotional neglect, even in a loving marriage, can have profound consequences. He also understood that while the sister's presence was temporary, the lessons he was learning about connection, empathy, and communication were lasting. And so, life continued, carrying the weight of emotions that were no longer hidden but also not fully resolved. He had discovered a safe space in which he could express his feelings, find understanding, and feel human connection again. But he also knew that the comfort he found in these conversations was a temporary relief, not a permanent solution. The real work, understanding himself, confronting the emotional distance in his marriage, and deciding how to move forward, still lay ahead. But despite the uncertainty and the tension, he felt a sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the sister's presence, for the unexpected connection, and for the reminder that life could still offer moments of understanding and kindness. and as he lay awake on the nights when they had talked late into the evening, he realized that sometimes the smallest gestures, a knock on the door, a whispered conversation, could illuminate even the darkest corners of loneliness. The quiet nights and soft conversations had become a comfort he didn't want to lose. But comfort, as he was learning, could be dangerous when it blinded him to reality.
Over the weeks, the presence of his wife's sister had changed him in subtle ways.
He laughed more often, talked more openly, and felt lighter than he had in years. But these changes did not go unnoticed. His wife began to sense that something in the house had shifted. She didn't know exactly what it was, only that her husband seemed different, more alive, more present in ways she hadn't seen in a long time. It started with small questions. "Have you been talking to her a lot?" she asked casually one evening, her tone curious but not accusatory. He hesitated, unsure of how to answer. The truth would sound heavier than it was, and he wasn't ready to share all the late-night conversations, the shared confessions, and the emotional connection that had grown between him and her sister. He tried to brush it off, saying, "We just talk sometimes, nothing serious," but he could see a flicker of concern in her eyes. That flicker was enough to make him uneasy. Over the next few days, the tension in the house grew. Every interaction felt heavier, every glance more significant. He realized that he could no longer ignore the fact that his emotional closeness with the sister was affecting not just him but the entire household. What had begun as harmless support had begun to blur lines, and he understood that he had to confront the situation before it went any further. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him heavier than any loneliness he had felt before. One evening, unable to contain the unease any longer, he decided to speak with his wife. He chose a quiet moment after dinner, when they were both sitting in the living room. His heart pounded as he began to explain, carefully, that he had been feeling emotionally distant from her for years. He spoke about the loneliness he had carried, the nights he had slept alone, and the quiet despair that had crept into their marriage. She listened silently, her expression unreadable, and he felt a mix of relief and fear. Finally, the truth was out, but it was heavier than he had expected. Then came the hardest part, explaining the emotional support he had found in her sister. He tried to be careful with his words, emphasizing that nothing inappropriate had happened, but that the sister had offered understanding and empathy he had long missed. His wife's silence stretched uncomfortably between them.
Ray, he watched her face, trying to gauge her reaction.
He wanted her to understand that he hadn't sought to replace her, only to survive emotionally in a situation that had long felt impossible.
The conversation quickly turned intense. His wife expressed hurt, confusion, and even anger. She asked why he hadn't spoken to her sooner, why he had let the distance grow without addressing it. He didn't have easy answers. For years he had avoided conflict, hoping that things would improve naturally. Now, the consequences of inaction were clear. The emotional bond with her sister, which had once felt like solace, was now a mirror reflecting everything that had gone wrong in their marriage. It was a turning point. The quiet, familiar life they had shared was no longer an option. They had to confront the emotional truth that had been ignored for too long. He realized that the sister's presence had been both a catalyst and a warning. She had shown him what it felt like to be understood and valued, but she had also exposed the fragility of his marriage. For the first time in years, he felt the full weight of responsibility, not just for his feelings, but for the emotional health of everyone involved. The days that followed were tense and emotionally charged. He and his wife began talking more openly than they had in years, addressing not just the situation with her sister, but the deeper issues that had driven them apart. They discussed missed opportunities, unspoken grievances, and the ways they had allowed routine and habit to replace emotional intimacy.
The conversations were uncomfortable, painful, and sometimes heated, but they were necessary.
He realized that avoiding the truth for years had only intensified the loneliness he had felt. Meanwhile, the sister remained a quiet presence in the house, aware that the dynamic had shifted. She kept her distance, respecting the boundaries that were now more clearly defined. Her role had changed from a nightly confidant to a reminder of both the comfort and the complications that had arisen. She continued to offer support when appropriate, but understood that the turning point had arrived. The emotional landscape had shifted, and everyone had to adjust to the new reality. In these days of confrontation and reflection, he began to understand the lessons of the past years. He realized that emotional neglect, even in the absence of malice, can have profound consequences. The loneliness is not just the absence of physical presence, it is the absence of being seen, heard, and understood. He had spent years suffering in silence, and now, in the wake of honest confrontation, he saw how critical communication and empathy truly were. He also began to reflect on his own role in the situation. The bond he had formed with the sister had been a symptom of a larger problem, not the cause.
He understood that he had been passive in his marriage, allowing distance to grow rather than addressing it directly.
The turning point forced him to confront not only the emotional realities of the household, but also his own responsibility in shaping them.
He felt both remorse and determination, a desire to correct mistakes and rebuild understanding, even if the outcome remained uncertain.
At the same time, he noticed subtle shifts in himself.
The emotional clarity that came with confrontation allowed him to see things more objectively. He could recognize patterns of avoidance, understand his own needs, and acknowledge the mistakes that had contributed to the loneliness he had endured. But he also saw the courage it took to face difficult conversations head-on. The courage he hadn't realized he possessed. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of agency over his life, rather than being carried along by circumstance. The turning point also brought unexpected moments of vulnerability. His wife shared feelings of hurt and disappointment that he had long avoided, recounting moments when she had felt disconnected, ignored, or unappreciated. He listened without interruption, realizing that empathy worked both ways. The emotional intimacy he had sought with the sister had been important, but it could not replace the depth of understanding that comes from addressing the roots of a relationship. Together they began to navigate the complex terrain of reconciliation, learning that rebuilding trust and closeness takes time, patience, and honesty. During this period, he also reflected on the sister's role in their lives. She had been a catalyst, showing him the importance of emotional presence, empathy, and communication. But he understood that her involvement was temporary, and the real work lay within his marriage.
Bye-bye.
He was grateful for her support, but knew that the turning point meant stepping back from that source of comfort and focusing on the long-term health of his relationship with his wife.
Even with the emotional intensity, there were small victories.
Moments of laughter returned, shared memories were revisited with warmth, and small gestures of kindness were exchanged. These moments, though fleeting, reminded him that relationships are dynamic, capable of renewal even after years of silence. He realized that the turning point, difficult as it was, offered a chance to rebuild something stronger than before. A relationship grounded in honesty, empathy, and mutual understanding. As the days passed, the house felt different. The quiet that had once pressed heavily on him was replaced by a tentative, cautious warmth. Conversations flowed more freely, smiles appeared more often, and the sense of isolation that had defined his nights began to recede. He knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. Old habits, past neglect, and lingering emotions would require continued effort. But the turning point had arrived, and with it, a sense of possibility. Desperate, he also understood that life was rarely simple. Emotional challenges do not resolve quickly, and relationships require constant attention and care. The turning point had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths, face his own role in past neglect, and navigate the delicate balance of human emotions. Yet despite the difficulty, he felt a quiet determination. He had learned that avoidance only deepens loneliness, and that connection, honesty, and empathy are essential for survival, not just in marriage but in life. In the end, the turning point marked a new beginning. It was not a sudden resolution, but a moment of clarity that illuminated the path forward. He understood the value of communication, the importance of empathy, and the necessity of emotional honesty. The sister's presence, while no longer central, had shown him the depths of what he had been missing. Rhyme and his wife, finally aware of the emotional distance and its consequences, had the opportunity to engage in rebuilding the bond that had been neglected for so long. And so, life continued, changed but not yet resolved. The turning point had arrived, forcing confrontation, reflection, and emotional reckoning. It was a moment that could not be ignored, a challenge that could not be evaded. And as he moved forward, he carried with him the lessons of empathy, honesty, and courage, lessons that would shape not only his relationship with his wife, but also his understanding of himself and the human need for connection.
After the turning point, life in the house began to feel different, though not immediately easier. The air was no longer heavy with unspoken words, but the weight of what had been ignored for years still lingered.
He and his wife were learning to navigate a new emotional landscape, one filled with both hope and uncertainty. They had begun to speak openly, to acknowledge the distance that had formed between them, and to explore what had gone wrong. It was not simple, nor was it comfortable, but it was necessary. The sister's presence in the house became quieter, more distant. Despair began in someone yet, not a half busk, which shadowed tears in the token of bat. Someone made no sense. But she carried. Her role had shifted from confidant to gentle observer, someone who had catalyzed change but was no longer central to the daily emotional flow. Her quiet withdrawal allowed him and his wife to face each other honestly, without the distraction of a third party. At first, the silence left by her withdrawal was noticeable. He realized just how accustomed he had become to her presence, her soft laughter, and the quiet conversations that had stretched into the night. For a moment, he worried that the absence of that comfort might return the heavy loneliness he had lived with for years. But he soon understood that what mattered was not the sister herself, but the awareness she had awakened within him. The recognition that emotional connection was essential, that loneliness could not be ignored, and that communication with his wife could no longer be avoided. He began spending more time with his wife, deliberately creating small moments of connection. They ate meals together, walked through the neighborhood, and spoke honestly about their feelings and fears. Sometimes the conversations were awkward, sometimes quiet, sometimes emotional. But slowly these moments began to rebuild trust, intimacy, and understanding. He realized that intimacy was not just physical, it was shared experiences, attention, empathy, and the willingness to truly see one another. Reflecting on the months that had passed, he recognized the role of the sister not as a substitute for his wife, but as a mirror showing him the consequences of neglect. Her presence had highlighted the emotional distance in his marriage, and while it had provided temporary relief, it had also forced him to confront the deeper issues that required resolution. Without her intervention, he might still have been trapped in silent loneliness, unaware of how much he had been missing.
His wife, too, had begun to confront her own part in the distance that had grown between them.
She admitted that she had been caught up in work, routine, and habit, overlooking the small gestures and attentiveness that sustain a relationship. Together, they acknowledge that marriage requires constant effort, communication, and care. Breaths. It is not simply a state of being, but an ongoing process of connection and understanding. This realization was painful at first, but ultimately freeing. They could no longer pretend that everything was fine, but they could begin to build something stronger, based on honesty and mutual effort. In these months, he also reflected on himself. He realized that part of his struggle had been his own silence and avoidance. For years, he had suppressed his needs, hidden his loneliness, and convinced himself that routine and habit were enough to maintain a marriage. Breath. Now he understood that acknowledging one's own emotional needs is not selfish. It is necessary for a healthy relationship. He had learned that emotional honesty, courage, and vulnerability are not weaknesses, but essential parts of human connection. The house, once heavy with silence, gradually began to feel alive again. Small gestures, holding hands, shared laughter, casual conversations became meaningful markers of progress. Even ordinary routines like cooking together or watching television became opportunities for connection. He realized that intimacy grows not just from grand gestures but from everyday moments of attention and care. The absence of emotional neglect created space for these small, powerful moments to flourish. Occasionally he thought of the sister, remembering the nights when she had knocked softly at his door and listened without judgment. He felt gratitude, not guilt, for her role in their lives. She had been a guide of sorts, showing him the importance of being seen and heard. But she had also respected boundaries and stepped back when it was necessary. Her influence remained, not as a presence in their lives, but as a lesson. Connection must be nurtured, and neglect has consequences that can't be ignored indefinitely. With the sister no longer central to the emotional dynamic, he and his wife were forced to rely on each other in ways they had not for years. This reliance was uncomfortable at first, but it became the foundation for genuine intimacy. They began to share their fears, hopes, and small joys. They acknowledged past mistakes without judgment, and they made commitments to actively care for one another. Slowly, the quiet distance that had defined their marriage began to shrink. He also noticed changes in himself outside the home. At work, he was more attentive, more patient, and more present in interactions with colleagues. He realized that the emotional growth he experienced at home affected his life in broader ways. The feeling seen and valued at home gave him the confidence and energy to engage more meaningfully with the world. The simple act of addressing emotional neglect at home had ripple effects, improving his overall sense of well-being and presence in life. Yet, he knew that the journey was ongoing. Emotional closeness and trust do not return instantly. They require consistent effort, empathy, and communication. He and his wife still had moments of tension, lingering doubts, and reminders of the years lost to silence. But these challenges were no longer obstacles he faced alone. They were opportunities to practice understanding, patience, and love. The turning point had taught him that relationships are dynamic, requiring constant attention and adaptation. Over time, he found a new rhythm in life, one filled with connection, understanding, and shared experience. Nights that had once been spent in solitude and quiet longing were now filled with conversation, warmth, and presence. He realized that the loneliness of the past had been a symptom, not the cause of the distance in his marriage. The real work lay in communication, empathy, and mutual effort, principles he now understood more deeply than ever. He reflected on the lessons learned from the sister's presence. She had been a catalyst, a reminder of what emotional connection could feel like. But the true resolution came from within. His willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, to take responsibility for emotional neglect, and to actively engage in rebuilding intimacy with his wife. He understood that gratitude and reflection are important, but they must be paired with action to create lasting change.
In these months, small victories became significant milestones.
A shared joke at dinner, a gentle touch, or a moment of genuine laughter carried weight. The house felt lighter, warmer, and more alive. Emotional honesty had replaced silence and empathy had replaced distance. He realized that intimacy is not simply the absence of conflict, but the presence of care, understanding, and consistent effort. He also noticed the impact of these changes on his wife. She was more open, more attentive, and more present. She asked questions, listened actively, and shared her own feelings. The two of them had discovered a new way of relating, not perfect, but authentic, grounded in reality, and focused on mutual understanding. This authenticity allowed them to build trust, even after years of neglect. Looking back, he saw the journey as a series of lessons. Loneliness, he understood now, is a signal, not a permanent state. Emotional neglect can creep quietly into relationships, creating distance that seems natural but is avoidable. Intervention, honesty, and empathy are crucial in preventing and addressing such neglect. And sometimes unexpected events, like the sister's visit, can illuminate truths that have been hidden for years, providing opportunities for growth and change. Finally, he understood that life would never be perfect. There would still be challenges, misunderstandings, and moments of doubt. But he now had tools to face these challenges: communication, emotional honesty, empathy, and the courage to address problems rather than ignore them. The house that had once been filled with silence and loneliness now carried the quiet strength of understanding, the warmth of shared effort, and the possibility of sustained connection. In the end, the experience changed him. He had survived years of solitude within his own home, rediscovered emotional connection through unexpected support, and finally confronted the deeper truths in his marriage.
The sister's presence had sparked reflection and awareness, but the resolution came from within. The conscious choice to rebuild, communicate, and care for his wife and their shared life. He realized that emotional connection, though fragile, is resilient when nurtured.
Loneliness is not inevitable, and silence is not permanent. Through attention, empathy, and action, even relationships long neglected can be healed. But journey was difficult, the turning point challenging, but the aftermath brought understanding, growth, and hope. Life was no longer empty or quiet. It was alive with possibility, reflection, and a renewed commitment to love, presence, and mutual care.